Welcome everyone to the Humanities in Prison Symposium if you're just joining us. We are now going to have a panel on teaching literature and the arts. And I will quickly moderate by introducing our speakers. I'm Erin Nerstad, Associate Director of the Humanities Center, and then I'm going to hand it over to Kevin and Susan, who will be in dialogue with each other over the course of the panel.
If I can figure this out.
I think
now blocks, these behind blocks, the cushy one.
Grab another one. Grab a whole one selection. So Dr. Kevin Bott is the Dean for Civic Engagement at Wagner College in New York City. He has trained and worked as a theater artist for over 30 years and is a scholar and facilitator of grassroots and community-based performance. He is the former Associate Director and Director of Cultural Organizing for Imagining America, Artists and Scholars in Public Life. He is also the former Director of Education for the New York State nonprofit Rehabilitation Through the Arts. His current work is called Ritual for Return, focusing on men and women returning from prison. Bott earned a BA from Rutgers University and his master's and doctoral degrees from New York University. He was married with 2 sons and a brand new daughter. We are grateful that he is here with us. And Susan Derwin is Director of the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center and also Professor of German and Comparative Literature. Her research and teaching focus on the relation between writing and healing. She is Director of Foundation in the Humanities, a correspondence course in literature that is run in partnership with the Los Angeles Archdiocese and multiple state prisons. Please join me in welcoming our presenters.
And before we start, I just want to say we are really going to have a kind of dialogue. Kevin is going to present his work. I'm going to tell you the story of our work, and then we're going to open it up to one another and to all of you so we can continue to discuss some of the very interesting questions that came up in the first panel, and then add our own thoughts.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see.
No.
I'm glad to see. I don't think you have a whole written thing because I don't.
No,
Okay.
but you're a theater guy.
Okay, so here we go. Well, first of all, I just want to say thanks to Susan and thanks to the organizers of this event, and a particular thanks because the work that I'm doing now, I hadn't realized all the connections, but as I was listening, I should just say I'm trained as an actor. The last professional performance that I did was at Princeton's McCarter Theater in a production of The Odyssey, directed by Mary Zimmerman. And then this project that I'm going to describe today, which is called Ritual for Return. And this is the only slide I have. I just wanted to throw it up so you could see it and maybe travel to it. When I first conceived of this project as a doc student at NYU, I was living in Ithaca, in New York, not in Greece. And it's been 10 years to get back to it. So I've had an Odysseus-like journey to return to this work that's so important to me. You know, the question of why the humanities and why the arts from the last session really resonates with me because I ask myself that all the time. I'm really driven. There's a wonderful prophetic Muslim verse, Islamic verse, that's translated to say, if you have a seed in your hand, even if the end times are upon you, plant it. And I feel that that is the work that we do. We're planting seeds in the soil of catastrophe, utter catastrophe. It is the end of times. And I mean that to say that we are living under a regime of systematic dehumanization. We're all being dehumanized. Yes, as the dean says, those who are incarcerated are certainly grossly being dehumanized, but so are all of we in many different ways, including with our complicity, our silent, passive complicity with mass incarceration and all of the surveillance and forms of punishment that we impose upon one another. And so the work that we do is transgressive because it is a project of rehumanization. And that is the healing work that we all need to be invested in. How do we rediscover humanity in a world that is increasingly technical and rational, that has no space for non-consumers? Those folks are disposable, literally disposable, as you heard in the last session, as we all know from our prison work. So I worked in prisons in New York State from 2006 to 2008. And I got out of it. And the reason I was in it was because of that possibility of reanimating myself and others with these modalities of humanity. Embodied work, the voice, critical thinking, empathy, all of the things that we know that people gain from educative processes within prison. The frustration for me in that work was the fear. Michael Balfour is an applied theater artist in the UK, and he says when you're working in prison, you have to walk a very narrow tightrope between transgression and incorporation into the institution. And I worked for an organization called Rehabilitation Through the Arts. Well, the implied rehabilitation is about the people inside, right? We're rehabilitating these animals, these people who have transgressed against the norms of society. And inside an institution, there's no space to ask the other questions about the larger rehabilitation that needs to happen that actually victimize these people, right? So we're only focusing on not only rehabilitating the men, but then setting up a very elaborate performance of their rehabilitation for the wider public. See, look what we can do. The arts or the humanities can save these people and make them safe to come back in. And what are they coming back to? A disaster from which they left, right? So I had to get out of it. I asked myself, what else I could do, and those thoughts coincided with a guy in a max security prison called Greenhaven, a couple hours outside the city, who came up to me and said, hey, I made the board and I'm getting out, and what's on the outside? Because this work in the arts has meant so much to me. And when I researched, this was back in 2008, there's not much out for men and women coming back from prison. This is sort of on the other side of what Michael does. I mean, to create an arts program or any kind of educational program that's not mandated by your parole officer or by someone else is a really tough sell. What incentive does a person who's just spent 10 to 25 years in prison, as they're trying to just survive and get their lives together in a world they don't even know anymore, why are they going to come to play practice every week? That doesn't make any sense. So how do you encourage people to come together? So it got me to thinking, okay, this can't just be a theater program. What would a theater project related to reentry be? And I immediately discovered, going to the NYU library, the very first book I pulled was a book called But They All Come Back by a scholar named Jeremy. He's not a scholar, he was the president of John Jay. He's a criminal justice guy who used to work for Janet Reno in the Bill Clinton administration. He wrote a book called But They All Come Back, and in chapter 10 of that book, he outlines a very long, decades-long body of literature in anthropology and sociology talking about the potential efficacy of ritual and rites of passage in prisoner reentry. And the case that he makes is that the process of being incarcerated is very theatrical, and it's a rite of passage. First of all, it's theatrical in that the cops actually read a script called Miranda Rights, if you're lucky. They'll read that to you. Everyone's wearing costumes, and importantly, there is a performance. There's a public performance, and that public performance is a rite of passage, because what a rite of passage is a public and communally affirmed announcement of one's change in social status. And that social status can go up or down. Well, the conviction is a social degradation rite of passage. But as you probably all know, when you are released from prison, there is no such status change ceremony that happens. You don't then get elevated back up to your original rank or any other rank, right? You're handed usually a clear plastic bag with your belongings, and at least in New York, you're handed a train ticket to the city, and that's it. And so what I started thinking about, so just one thing I'll say is that what Jeremy Travis proposed and what Janet Reno decided to go forward with was they put out a call in 2001 for reentry courts, ostensibly taking some of this literature, but when I talked to people in the reentry courts, of course they knew nothing about any of this literature, but the idea was that there would be more personal one-on-one kind of ceremonies that would, there would be graduation ceremonies. You do some 6 months with a one-on-one caseworker and a judge who would know you a little bit more, and at the end of it, you would have a graduation ceremony, and your family would be there, and the theory is that you would then not feel like you were still back in prison. Well, so try to imagine now, what is a ritual or rite of passage? It's first of all, highly aesthetic, it's performative, it's communal, it gives voice to the initiations. So imagine all of that run through the administrative bureaucratic logic of the court. It's horrible. It's the worst thing ever. I mean, it actually does more harm than good. So as a theater artist, I set out to create an alive, humane version of what I thought a reentry rite of passage would look like. And so this is just one image from that. But there's a second reason that I started it. And that's because, it's not why I started it. I did this project, the pilot project for this in 2009. I finished my dissertation in 2010. In 2010, Michelle Alexander wrote The New Jim Crow. So we all know now from reading that book that Michelle Alexander makes two cases. One, we need a new civil rights movement to dismantle mass incarceration. And secondly, that she doesn't explicitly say this, but what I take from it is that incarceration is not the disease, it's a symptom of the disease, right? Because if it was the disease, it wouldn't have gone from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration. We would have eradicated something along the way. It's a symptom. And so we have to recognize that even if we dismantle mass incarceration, the disease remains. That disease is, I think of it as dehumanization. Call it hate, call it fear, call it anger, call it all the things we've not evolved far enough along to solve. So the question for me is, how do we build a movement to eradicate the disease? I think we're at a point in our human history, we cannot rely on technical rational solutions for wicked problems. We've known that for 5 decades or 6 decades, but we're not that smart. We think we're really smart. But the problems keep getting worse because there's no humanity in what we're doing. Art is what makes us human. Imagining unimaginable futures is what makes us different from other animals. We need to be building a movement. If you have cancer and you've tried every solution that's known, you got to go to solutions that aren't known. You start doing crazy things to try to eradicate the disease. So when I talk to policymakers about this is the crazy, alternative medicine version of how to solve mass incarceration. It's insurance ain't covering it, right? No one can understand how this fits in to a suite of services. At the same time, when I talk to theater people, it doesn't make sense because it's not a running performance. What this is, and this I'll just stop here. This is a one-time only rite of passage. It's a 12-week program bookended by 2 weekend intensives where we do mask work, we do drumming, we do yoga and meditation. It's trauma-informed in that we know now that trauma is lodged in the body. It's not a rational thing. We need to express it through our bodies. And the men tell their stories, and we theatricalize those stories. We anonymize them in some ways. But at the end of it, we do one thing that's non-rehearsable. And that is that each of the participants has to decide for themselves what is their threshold. What is the thing that for them will move them beyond the identity as an ex-con, as a felon, as whatever that old life was? And it's not for anyone, including myself, to name. And if it means they have to, their rite of passage is looking at someone in the audience and saying, you fucking hurt me, fuck you, whatever that is, excuse my language, maybe that's it, and that has been it sometimes. Sometimes it's a song. Sometimes, I had one guy, and I know I'm going to get emotional when I say this, I got emotional on the phone when I told you. This guy said he'd been in, this guy was an accessory to murder. I'll just tell you a story really briefly. When he was oh man, I can feel it already. I'm looking at Kim Yasuda because she's seen me speak so many times, and I cry every single time I speak. No, I know you're not Kim Yasuda, sir, the woman behind you. You guys saying, I'm not Kim, I'm not Kim.
They're all Kim.
I'm with you, yeah.
Look at everyone and let it go.
When this guy was 4 years old, sweetest guy you'll ever meet, his family was so poor that 11 kids in the house, they couldn't find a second sock for him to wear to his first day of kindergarten. So he went to school with one sock, and from that day forward, at 4 years old, he was the kid that got picked on. And by the time he was in 3rd grade, he was learning how to fight, and by the time he was in 8th grade, he was in a gang, and by the time he was 18, he followed the crowd into a bodega where, unbeknownst to him, the leader had brought a gun, and they killed the Korean bodega owner. The guy who shot the weapon was out in 15 years. My accessory, who had public representation, did 25. He went in at 18, he got out at 41 years old. And he found this program a year after he was released. He got up and said, I don't even know how to do this. What's my rite of passage? So I never know what they're going to say. I just say, look, when we've done the parts we practiced and we talked about, you're getting up in the circle that we've made, the spotlight's going to be on you, and you say what you got to say, or do what you got to do, whatever that rite of passage is. Because a rite of passage is performative. If you don't put the ring on the finger and say, I do, it doesn't work. If the community isn't around you to affirm and hold you accountable for the actions that you say you're committed to, it doesn't work. So they have to perform. They have to step across the threshold in some way. And so, he said, listen, I don't know how to do this, but if there's anyone out here in the audience that's been incarcerated that can pull me across this threshold and show me how to do it. And these two jacked guys, they were really big guys, stood up from opposite parts of the theater, and they walked in, and they bear hugged him, and of course, everyone's bawling, including me, and they pulled him across, and that's what he needed. And 3 years later, we were invited by the New School in New York to do a demonstration project as part of the Imagining America conference. And 3 of the 4 guys who created this with me agreed to do it. The 4th had moved out of state, he wasn't available. The night before we were to do a kind of brush-up rehearsal, because we hadn't seen each other in 3 years, 2 of the men called me and said, I can't do it. And I said, what's up? We're like ready to go. And they called me separately, they hadn't spoken to each other, but they said, we crossed the threshold. And to do it as a show, we can't go back across. We're free. We're out. We're done. I keep saying finally, but there's just one more piece. I promise. I just want to. So in terms of the movement building, I just want to say the idea for this project is inspired by Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's inspired by the Rwandan and South African reconciliation projects. This is meant to be something that people go through, and then I would like to train the trainers so that it is something that is run by men and women who come out of prison to take their brothers and sisters through that crossing, that they become the shaman, they become the elders, they go through this transformative process, and it's an each one teach one. Because to deal with 700,000 people who get out of prison every year, we need to scale, right? And it needs to be intentional. And it needs to be grassroots, because we can't rely on politicians, we can't rely on the whims of the public perceptions of being tough on crime or not tough on crime. It's not going to work. Every movement has to be grassroots. It has to have culture in the center, because every movement does have culture in the center, even though we forget that a lot of times. And of of course, those closest to the problems are closest to the solutions. So this is about something that brings men through it. Men, I say men because that's what I've done so far, although I'm working on one with women. It brings people through the process. It allows them to develop leadership capacity, to lead other people through the process, and to do healing in the community who are witnesses to this project, and then to scale, then to take it out, and try to figure out how to really re-inject culture into communities where culture has been obliterated, really been obliterated, by mass incarceration, by crack, and by a number of other, by violence, of course. It's a rehumanization project.
Right, and I just want to say, we have talked about this, I think the fact that it couldn't be repeated is a sign of its success, because it was experiential. It was a performative, transformative experience. So, which really attests to the way in which the skills that you were imparting were those of tools for living and transformation. So frustrating as the moment was, it's a piece with what I think you were trying to achieve. All right, well, thank you. I'm going to tell a story. I'll be as brief as I can, and it's a story about how the Foundations in the Humanities project or course really came into being. I think it will be illustrative, I hope, of some of the questions and problems even that we've raised today, and then, my hope is that we can open up for more discussion. So, this is how this story begins. A former UCSB student of mine was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison after he had graduated from the university. He was an Iraq War veteran, and he had been in a writing workshop for several years that I had been running for veterans who were now students at UC Santa Barbara. And after he graduated, we actually continued to work together. He was a quite gifted writer, and he continued to write about his military experiences with me. He then became incarcerated. We continued to correspond. He continued to write about his wartime experiences while he was in prison. And then he reached a point when he said to me, through the mails, well, I can't do this anymore because I can't write about war when I'm at war. And being on the inside, he said, was like being in Iraq, only it was worse because the war was the war of gladiators, and he was fighting, he had to train himself to survive. So, so we switched to reading, and he was a reader, and he continued to read, and we would write about, we would have dialogue about what he was reading. And our exchange lasted like this for about a year, and then he asked me if I would start a correspondence course in literature for other of the men on the inside with him. And I agreed. So there was a lot of back and forth. I'm sort of streamlining, but we did decide in the end that it would be about literature. That would be our medium. And of course, why did he want a correspondence course? He had been by this time in literature. He had been by this time in a number of facilities. At the time we were planning this, he was at a maximum security prison. And the problem, which is the problem everywhere, not only in maximum security prisons, is the constant lockdowns. And so the lockdowns, when they happen, as many of you know who work in the prisons, mean that all on-site services stop. And so the efficacy of having a correspondence course would be that he could keep doing his work when he was confined to a cell. Made good sense to me. He also told me, he communicated that he had become a kind of freelance advocate, caseworker for other prisoners, helping them to write letters, petitions, statements, doing research, translating, you name it. And it was just, it happened. And he said in a letter, as we were developing this work, and I'm quoting from it, Iraq showed me what I was made of. Prison is showing me who I am. I used to believe, and by this time I believe he was in a serious depression. He was suicidal. I used to believe that if you have the ability and knowledge to help others, that it is not just your responsibility, but also your duty. I've realized that I still believe this, even though I still desire seclusion. So he was very aware of his ambivalence about doing this, but in fact, though he didn't say this to me, I do believe that he wanted to cultivate a community for himself on the inside, a community that could come together and that he could facilitate by serving in creating this organization. And what he said that was very important is that he really knew himself, I think his best self, his most alive self, by serving others. And I think this is not only true of him, but I think it's a theme that runs through what happens when you're involved in this kind of shared learning, which is the way in which I see these educational problems. Shared meaning shared both among the student participants and with the facilitators and educators. So, all right, how do you do this? Well, he had sent me, my student, one unit of a correspondence course that he was involved in life skills. And he thought that this would be a good template. It was a series of units that you will learn about this afternoon because we have a presentation on it. I'm going to get there in a minute. But what was important for my purposes, our purposes, is that it was a series of themes or topics that had a focus, and then asked of the participant that they answer questions in short answer form. And I thought, well, this was good. We were going to expand it to have a series of units on literary texts that would be accompanied by, so the unit is a short reading with a series of questions that the participants answer in essay form. So in any given unit around a piece of literature, the students are writing about 1,000 words. And I created a syllabus, this was after doing a couple of things, talking with people who were involved in education, really 3 things. Of course, seeing and discussing the kinds of things he wanted to read at this point while and as an incarcerated individual. And I also spoke with Jess, and she told a story about her most successful unit of teaching at the end, which was very important. Namely, and I'm going to repeat this, and I repeat it because it's a difficult, I think, it's a difficult truth to accept for some people doing prison education who have a kind of, and I don't mean this word pejoratively, an agenda, a kind of abolitionist agenda or intention or passion or belief, as we all might. But in doing the work, what became very clear was that the men with whom my student was working and the men then with whom we later worked knew more about shades of prejudice and enslavement than we ever could on the outside. And they did not want to read text that mirrored their living reality. They wanted to read text that enabled them to move with their minds into other spaces and places and other imagined realities and experiences. That, in a way, is the most abstract way of putting it. On the other hand, there's a real crave for realism, because if you have been incarcerated for a couple of decades, the things that we take for granted, and forget the cell phone, which in fact, of course, there's more exposure to inside than other technological tools, but just the mechanics of living are mysterious. And if you are preparing for parole and release, you are very concerned and curious about how you're going to navigate this world. So realism is another kind of coveted tool. So created our syllabus and spent a summer trying to respectfully find a way to be welcome into a prison. I'm not going to go into the Baroque itinerary of my student, who of course was transferred multiple times, and by now I was trying to get into sites where he wasn't anymore, and I mean, we didn't catch up with one another really. But I utterly failed. I spent 4 months, I was talking to people in other states, I was being advised, nobody responded to me. So really, as a last resort, I saw who was running the life skills correspondence program that my student had been involved in, and I called her up. And she is Sister Mary Sean Hodges, who is in our audience, who will be speaking with us later, who, through the Los Angeles Archdiocese, has been running a program, is it for 10 or 12 years?
16.
16, how about that? And you have worked with how many men and women? 10,000, 12,000 men and women more throughout the state through this correspondence program. And Sister Mary said, I'm your partner. And I think within a matter of weeks, she was here at UC Santa Barbara with 3 of the individuals with whom she works in this program, which you will learn about, and we were figuring out how to be partners. And what that meant was not only that I would now have access to students, because I didn't know how we were going to get students, but I was going to be able to go into the prison or prisons with Sister Mary and launch the program by teaching on site. And that's what we did. We started at one prison, we went to another, we were trying to go to a third, we're told that we had to do special training, which we did, we still weren't allowed. None of that really matters for our purposes, but what does matter is that this is the way we have now launched a program that is running. We're at the end of our 2nd year. The first time we went into a prison, we were hoping to have 10 participants come into the class. And the plan was for me, and this is in fact what we did, I went in and taught a class about a poem. And we spent 2.5 hours, 3 times. We had 3 meetings, teaching and working together. And that was quite a effective, I think, successful experience. I'll talk about why briefly in a minute. So we were hoping to have 10 people sign up. Well, in fact, and what happened was after we did our work together, I said to the students who would come into the room, if you're interested, here's my address, write to me at the Humanities Center, and we will sign you up. And that was an important step. I didn't want to pass out, I wanted the first part of the agenda process, all right, show your investment. So 64 men signed up. And I thought, well, this is going to be a problem. So we put together a program to involve 5 graduate students. And an aside, because this is not what our focus is today, but here at the Humanities Center, in tandem with this work, we have been doing other projects that are serving the interests of our graduate program. So this is very important to me to say that the work we're doing here is not voluntary, it's not an additive to graduate training, it's not something that we do out of the goodness of our hearts. What's inside the heart doesn't much matter in doing this work, and we could even come back to that. But we are very interested in response to our students' desires and practically in terms of really what it takes to continue to practice as an academic or an engaged humanist, to practice the skills that we have learned at the university in pursuing PhDs in the humanities. And of course, one of the things that is important to be able to do, if you're interested in doing, and many of our students are, is working with different kinds of populations, interacting in different kinds of classroom settings, and really developing our pedagogy so that it has consequence in the broader world, not only, but of course necessarily, in the university. And I dare say already, and we're going to hear from the student instructors later, shortly after our panel, or directly after our panel, that doing this work also makes you, I think, a far better teacher wherever you go, whatever you do, including, at the university. So we developed our cadre of graduate students to help us interact with the students who had signed up. And that's exactly what they do. The students are sent work, they respond. to the stories and poems and text through a series of questions, and our mentors engage with them in a kind of dialogue through the mails, which take probably 8 months at a time because of the vicissitudes of the mails, getting mail inside and out of the prisons and the various steps and readings and inspections that they must go through. So I want to say just a couple of things about what I've learned and seen, the effect or the impact of this work. And I'll say that the first visits at the prisons when I was introducing the course were really good. And of course, when you are here working together, there's inside, what I found repeatedly, that there's a kind of focus and presence that the students bring into the classroom that makes it really a pleasure. There aren't the distractions that of course we have on campus. So the work was good, except when I came back, because we then came back for a second visit and worked with the men who had already been through the program, and were now, by the way, wanting a second Foundations in the Humanities course, which we developed so that we have now a number of courses going. And this program has the possibility of being sort of exponentially developed, which we hope to be able to do. But when I came back the second time and worked with them, I saw such a predictable but gratifying change in the kinds of readers they have become. And I think I want to emphasize that the work we're doing together, maybe we'll talk about this, I see my role as someone who brings a tool into the classroom, a skill that is then developed and shared together. I might, through that work on a text, but it's a third object. It's not, I may care, I may enliven, our humanism, our humanities, our humanists may be enlivened, but I think it's, for me, important to recognize that we're doing this by doing shared work together on a third thing, on a text, that we can come, it's our common denominator. We come together, we discuss it, we bring different points of view and histories and backgrounds and ways of reading, but what's crucial in the end is that our work is mediated through work together on something that we both are interested in, which is reading. So, just though to report what I'm learning about their experience, I will organize my last couple of minutes of comments about around really a theme. And I think what that theme is relationship building. I think that everything that happens is a variation on relationship building. And here's what I mean by that. First of all, there's the literal relationship building, the dialogues with their mentors, their facilitators. They're also, which builds a kind of relationship, a kind of shared experience over a text. Of course, it does matter, and the students write about what it is like to, and I don't want to say, and I maybe sound hard, it's not that they see we care on the outside, but they experience that their ideas and thinking are being received and responded to. And that is very important that their ideas resonate in other minds on the outside. So this is talked about. The reading has created a different kind of dialogue inside of the prisons because the students meet with themselves now. They want to continue the conversations about the texts. And of course, this is a rather stealthy thing they're doing because who can disrupt a gathering when it's not about claiming territory on the inside, but about talking about a Jack London story, right? So they are building alliances based upon a shared interest. And it was said last time we were there, one man looked at another and said, I don't have to like you, but I really am interested in learning about what you think about this story. So I think that's very important, that they're developing identities, diversifying their own identities. They are readers with investments in these sort of cultural productions. Number two, of course they're learning to have a dialogue with themselves. Because if we can say anything about prison life, it's that it is both a time when you are never alone, even when you are in solitary, the noise itself, and in a way you are often lonely. And so that the conversations that are had between people become, to use a kind of psychoanalytic word, introjected. And by the way, I wouldn't talk about this as therapy if by that we mean we're responding to a malady. Okay, this is not, but of course we use the word therapy broadly today. But I think that what's happening is that the students, and this happens to all readers, are learning to be alone with themselves because they are creating an internal dialogue, which is what a readerly experience is. So I think that's an important kind of relationship building with oneself. Some of the men said, and by the way, some of the men said things like, I now have interesting or other things to talk about with the young people in my lives on the outside, with my children, my nieces, my nephews, who I don't want to talk about what happens on the yard all the time, but we're talking about what we're reading. And she's telling me what she's doing in school. And there's sort of a soil cultivated, talk about was it you using the germ, the seed that's germinating? Someone said that, yeah. That there's a kind of social soil of shared learning that is being developed. Another man said that he was, the same man who was very concerned about what happens, he was coming up before the parole board, that he didn't really like the idea of being released and having to rely on his wife for everything, because he doesn't know anything how to navigate in the world. And so we talked about, and this was mentioned, I think the Buddhist, a Buddhist who was in one of your classes, we talked about what it means, what hermits did historically, how the retreat from the world to gain wisdom that could be imparted. Well, this was not analogous, it was imposed, it still presented the same kind of opportunity. Because what was he doing? He was studying himself in relation to these texts. He had time to develop a kind of wisdom that could be a guide and a resource when he left prison. So that was a valuable resource. We also talked about, you could be a kind of counselor. So there was just one other exchange that I will mention now. I didn't realize I was going to, but it really made an impact on me. So we were sitting around, and Sister Mary and I were together, and someone said, we really like that we're getting this feedback. I mean, it is a kind of one-on-one, it's like a tutorial. We're getting this feedback so much, a full page of typed comments from our interlocutors, our students, our teachers. And then someone looked at Sister Mary and said, why don't we get more feedback from your program? And I said, wait a minute, you give the feedback. You're not just a consumer. They are busy serving 10,000 people in the state. You're lucky that you're even getting the lesson. I said, why don't you start discussion groups inside? You be agentive. You become the sort of co-creators of this kind of self-studying knowledge. And I think that it's true, and I think that they are. And I think that part of what we're teaching, what they're experiencing, is themselves themselves as agentive in various contexts. So, yeah, that's what I have to say. And so,
Yeah, I feel like we should just have a
let's
conversation.
have a conversation. Questions, thoughts, comments?
Questions?
What is the biggest obstacle you face while introducing the students to the material for the first time, if they're not receptive?
Well, I don't really think we face. I'll tell you the biggest obstacle or challenge I have as a teacher, wherever, and I guess, okay, here's an obstacle, I guess we could call it. One of the things that's really instructive to me about the kind of reading that can go on by incarcerated individuals is, I would call it, they have the capacity for holistic reading. When we sit at the university, we are taught that there are certain protocols to reading, often which involve a kind of disconnect between our life experiences and the text. Now, I'm not one to have students riff on associative, free association when they're reading a text. This reminds me of when I was doing this with my friend. But I do think kind of embodied learning that is able to bring one's own experiences into dialogue with the text is very good, a good kind of learning and a good kind of wisdom. And I have found that when we work with the students inside, that's what they do. They freely draw from their own experiences to meet the text. So that is, on the one hand, a wonderful resource. On the other hand, my role is to make sure the dialogue stays focused on the text. That always becomes the kind of medium, the currency in which we're working. So that's what I'd say. But I really, to be truthful, I really haven't yet seen that people don't, I mean, some don't really want to engage. Maybe we're just choosing particularly inviting texts, but
I just want to say one thing, or two things. I'm struck by you talking about agency. It made me think, it's just important to kind of name the bridge that happens between when we talk about the role of arts and humanities, and actually what it does and why what happens in a learning space might mean something in the outside world. Art is I think of it as the manipulation of aesthetic variables. That's what we're doing, whether we're writing or dancing or acting. We're taking certain variables like words, like light, darkness, sound, silence, and we're moving them around. And in all of the examples that people have named, that's what students are learning how to do. The agency comes from the ability to understand that you make choices, that everything is a choice, and that choice has meaning. The choice of what word to put where, or what to say, or how to move, affects how you'll be received. It affects the impact that you'll have on others. And of course, if people know their Joseph Beuys, who was a mid-20th century conceptual artist from Germany, Beuys' contribution is to say we are all artists, right? Our artistry is not confined to those who have specialized skill. But every utterance is an aesthetic variable. Every interaction that we have with one another is a moment of artistic interaction. And it affects the world. It creates the world, actually. So I think that sense of agency is tied to the recognition that we have agency in the choices that we make, and we, through art and literature and writing, have concrete examples. And for the men and women that we work with, that they have an example of that. But the flip side of this that I want to say is that we always rely on this idea that that agency is being cultivated in the people that we work with. Again, one of my issues with the work I did inside prison, I think that, first of all, having worked with people in prison, and maybe some of you experienced this, the fantasy life is rich about what life on the outside is going to be, what they can accomplish. Working in arts, I mean, everyone's got a screenplay. Everyone's going to, find a way to publish their book. Not very different from America writ large, but it's intensified because you're in a solitary state, and the fantasies are just amazing. What they think is going to be possible. It's another reason I think reentry work is so important, because that's when they're, hit up against the rocks of reality. I mean, it's not possible in a lot of instances. But I also think we have to break the idea that if only these folks had agency, things will be different. Because of course, the choices they make don't matter against a system that's unjust and out to get them. So they might learn how to make choices on the inside, and they might even make those choices on the outside, and they're still going to get shot. And they're still going to get arrested. We see it every single day. So again, it's just like, how do we deal with that? That no matter what skills we teach a young man of color, the odds are against that person. No matter how much agency they have, no matter how much critical thinking they have, no matter how much, whatever skill we're teaching them, the system is the problem. It has to be dismantled. And we have to be thinking of strategy. And this is why working on the inside for me is so tough, because it's not a place for resistance, right? The state is too powerful. The only option you have is physical, violent resistance, and that's not going to play. You have no chance in that environment. So what are other alternatives? Where are other spaces? My feeling is that when you have 700,000 people coming out of the revolving door, that's the moment of leverage. We have to figure out how to capture that knowledge and power.
How does a ritual for return?
You do that.
Yeah, because
Okay, so I wrote down all the things I forgot to say. So here's the thing. It's aspirational. I worked for 8 years for Imagining America, so it's all imagine, or just imagine. The idea is that it's a scalable project with an each one teach one ethos. I think connected to that has to be an AA-like project whereby the people who've gone through this have a Highlander Center-like weekly space that they can come back into. That the empowerment, that the transformation has to lead to somewhere. It has to lead to a bunch of empowered people sitting around strategizing and figuring out tactics for resistance. I mean, ultimately, this has to be a place. I mean, one of the things that comes out of this project is that, again, I know a lot of you know this, but you'll find people in prison and outside of prison, they have ingested the narrative that it's our fault. If only we made better choices, when I get out, I'll do different things. The structural is very difficult for them to see. That's why telling stories together is so important, because then they hear their story by 10 other people, and it's like, oh, this isn't about me, this is bigger than that. If part of the educational process is to reveal that structure, then maybe there's a possibility that strategy can start happening. And that's strategy that's led from the grassroots.
Thank you both so much, Susan. Your reminder of the centrality of relationship building and having this idea of planting seeds in an era of catastrophe is so potent. So thank you. And I would just love to kind of push us to think deeply about this question of agency, because I think for everybody, education, literacy is a way of awakening us to ourselves and connection to other people. And I feel like there's this kind of deeply ingrained, almost colonial embodiment of as if we give agency. And what I have witnessed from people in prison countless times across the nation is if only we were to go in and listen. There's so much. I mean, that's what I feel like that's our role as folks who are stepping in and out as visitors, to go in and say, what are your ideas and how can we help manifest what is already so clearly your agency? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
I have a response to that, which is about response. I think that what I hear in many conversations or discourses of agency is a little bit distinguishable from aggressivity, assertiveness, a kind of agentive actions are those based on those are people who know what to do. And what I've learned and what I believe is that to be agentive is to know how to respond. That is to know relationship, interactivity is not always about the first assertion. It's being responsive to the given, to the voice, to the analysis of the text. I'm looking at the students who work, and knowing how to take in, contain what you hear, and then work in dialogue with that moving forward, which is a different kind of agency than the he or she who knows coming in with the answers. It's saying, I don't have the answer, but my interest is in receiving your experience, what you're saying, and seeing what develops through that reception together. That's not a very substantive response, but I do believe it is about an interactivity that is predicated on suspending the attitude of going in with the answer and rather responding to the given as the first beginning of a way out of confusion.
I think we need to conclude this panel. We have a quick half-hour panel after this, and I invite you all to stay through that for lunch afterwards. So nobody move. We're going to totally change to the next panel and continue this discussion. So please thank our presenters.